Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the final session of today's European Forum, the 26th in the row. And as there is the saying, save the best for last, we are going to have a very open and interesting discussion on Europe's global role following Russia's war against Ukraine. And I couldn't dream for better guests to accompany me in this final session than those sitting next to me. So I will start first and foremost with a short presentation of my guests this evening. On my right, we have Céline MARANGÈ. She is Russia-Ukraine Senior Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Research, affiliated with the Ministry of Defense in Paris. On my left, we have Jamie Shih. He has been already a regular guest of our European Forum, and currently he is professor at the University of Exeter and Senior Fellow at Chatham House. But we also know him from his previous role as policy planning director with NATO. I'm moving once again to my right, and we have another regular guest of our European Forum. This is Mr. Roland FREUDENSTEIN, and currently he's the Vice President and Head of GLOBSEC Brussels. And last but not least, it's a great pleasure to welcome also Peter HEFELE. He is currently the Policy Director at Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. This is also the think tank that is supporting us to make the European Forum the success that it has been today. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and we are going to kick off this final session with Céline, who is going to give us a kind of a very, hopefully, quick overview of the current developments regarding Russia's war against Ukraine, and also will give us an idea about, let's say, overwhelming position, French position regarding the war. Céline, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I'm very pleased to be here, and I would like to thank Velina and the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy for their invitation, and also Sarah Martinov for her impeccable organization. So let me start, please, with a brief analysis of the military situation, which will allow me to outline the possible outcomes of the war in Ukraine, on Ukraine. And then I give you my perspective, a French perspective, on current defense and security issues in Europe. And I'll focus on the debate surrounding the desirable end state with Russia. So I begin with an assessment of the military standoff, and I'll outline only a few points because I was asked to be quick. First, I think the Russians are in big trouble from a military standpoint. I mean, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the north in early September took them by surprise. The Ukrainian army has achieved a stunning breakthrough and fulfilled, more importantly, the political mandate of obtaining a clear tactical victory to prove that Ukraine had not only the ambition but the capacity to regain territories. And I think that since then, Russian political and military elites have been aware that the war can be lost, especially since the partial mobilization led to the departure, as you know, of hundreds of thousands of men. And at the same time, the counteroffensive in the south, which in September was really difficult and deadly for the Ukrainian army, is on the way to success. Second point, the Russians failed to break Ukrainians' will and audacity. I mean, the sham referendums and the subsequent annexations did not have any paralyzing effect. I mean, the aim was presumably to free the front, to free the front line by extending nuclear coverage to the newly annexed territories. This move did not stop the Ukrainians, who will certainly retake Kherson and the entire western bank of the Dnieper in the weeks to come, maybe in days to come. And this did not prevent the Ukrainian army from defying Putin personally by hitting the breach that symbolizes his greatest achievement, that is the annexation of Crimea. Third point, the Russians are currently opting for a strategy of terror to reestablish a balance of power in their favor. So the recent and public appointment of General Surovikin, who really embodies the culture of impunity in Russian army, may be seen as a sign, a confirmation of that. I think that the Russian army now aims at destroying everything in Ukraine. It is no longer just a question of raising towns and villages in the regions to be conquered, but of bringing the country to its knees by plunging it into darkness, into cold during the winter. So this is, for instance, why electrical infrastructures have been systematically targeted over the past weeks. Fourth, at the same time, a collapse of the Russian army this winter can no longer be ruled out. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but it's a possibility. Because the Ukrainians are methodically undermining all nodes and all logistical routes of the Russian army to jeopardize its supply system. And they have been very successful in doing that. Moreover, I think it's highly doubtful that the Russian army will be able to equip, arm, train, winterize and feed hundreds of thousands of men, and to transform the mobilized manpower into an effective combat-ready force. I mean, there are many reasons for that, but I think that not only the Russian army has suffered heavy casualties among officers, but it is structurally deprived of non-commissioned officers. So therefore, the Russian army lacks intermediate command levels. I have also difficulties imagining how exhausted army soldiers, unmotivated draftees with almost no combat experience, Wagner mercenaries recruited in penal colonies, Kadyrovцы, and fanatic members of several ideological battalions will fight together. I mean, for me, it's a real... So for all these reasons, we can reasonably doubt that the Russian army will be able to regain the upper hand in the coming months and hold a front line of 1,100 kilometers. 5, nothing, in my opinion, can stop the war at this point. And for that very reason, it is, I think, too early to forecast possible outcomes, because winter will be decisive. This is my... So the Ukrainian leaders and society, and I would like to emphasize it, are convinced that their only chance of survival is to go all the way now, because the Russian army is weakened. So the prevalent idea is that if they stop now, the Russians will take the opportunity to recover and attack again later. It will be only an operational pause, yeah. So their aim now is to defeat the Russian army. They are no longer looking for peace. They want victory. They want victory, a clear victory, to preserve their independence, their sovereignty, and their freedom. So, in a sense, a war of aggression and conquest has turned into a war of national liberation. They say they want to take back all the territories conquered since 2014 and come back to the borders of 1991, so including Crimea. And this move, I think, would trigger a strong reaction from Russia. As for the Kremlin, I think it cannot afford a defeat. And judging by what Putin said at the Valdai Forum last week, he does not seem to have given up his initial war aims, that was to wipe Ukraine off the map and restore Russia in its imperial borders. So I think that the Russian president continues to believe that Ukraine is an artificial state, and he stated that last week, the last time what was that? And he believed that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. So I mean, in doing that, he's denying the very right to exist to the Ukrainian people and to the Ukrainian state. And moreover, the Russian president sees himself in an existential fight with NATO, with the US, and what they call in Russian the collective West. So from my point of view, and I had the question this morning, but from my point of view, given his definition of power, given his understanding of the stakes, Putin will never negotiate from a position of weakness. He will always choose, in my view, escalation. Therefore, Europe needs to be prepared for the possibility of escalation. But at the same time, Europe needs, and we need to be prepared for a rag-rag fight of long duration, of very long duration, unfortunately. In my view, the Kremlin is likely to opt for a twofold strategy at this point. In Ukraine, it will be a strategy of total destruction until exhaustion. And in Europe, it will be a strategy of maximum pressure until renouncement. So the two approaches are intertwined. You can imagine cold and dark winter in Ukraine will provoke new waves of refugees. Energy blackmail may result in skyrocketing energy prices in Europe, which will fuel social discontent and maybe bring more far-right or far-extreme parties to power. And I think that in this game, democracies have vulnerabilities, and we need to be aware of that. So in my view, these are the most pressing security and defense issues for the months and the years to come. As regards the assessment of nuclear risk, I think they are real. In my opinion, they are real. Of course, Russian nuclear provocation and denials at the same time are part of an information warfare that aims to inhibit the West and limit arms deliveries to Ukraine. But at the same time, the statements of propagandists and politicians in Russia can also be used to justify an attack in advance. And I think that they think about that in that way. I also want to underline that some Russian high-ranking officials, really high-ranking officials, and very famous experts have been questioning for years now. They have been questioning the very relevance of arms control negotiations and the commonly accepted idea that there are no winners in a nuclear war. Some, especially experts, some even propose, I quote, a flexible and selective conception of the use of nuclear power, in particular of tactical nukes. So, to limit those risks, Alexei Arbatov, who is a moderate Russian nuclear expert and who is the son of Georgy Arbatov, a former advisor to Gorbachev, proposed last summer to set up communication channels between Russian and American military commands on the model of the deconfliction mechanism used in Syria, in order to avoid misperceptions, unclear situation, and assessment errors. I think this is an idea that Europeans could and should support, for instance, and we could do maybe more for that. Just maybe, if I have, yeah. I think given the current situation, everyone in Europe is thinking about what we could do differently, how to improve the situation and how to improve our cooperation and mutual understanding of the problem. So new formats of cooperation are being explored, such as, for instance, the European Political Community that was proposed by the French president to foster intergovernmental cooperation. I think that NATO has been reinforced and new deployment occurred, especially in Eastern Europe. And the objective is to deter Russia of escalating. So this needs to be continued as well. And maybe lastly, as a Russia expert, I would like to give some comments related to our future relations with Russia. I think that in France, because I was asked to say a few words about the French perspective, and in France we need to examine more carefully, I think, some of our biases and assumptions. As the reluctance to see the war coming showed. I mean, in February in Paris, no one wanted to see it coming. Everyone was convinced that the Americans were exaggerating, as always, you know. And, well, so as this reluctance showed, there exist difficulties in Paris, but not only in Paris, in assessing opposing intents, when our values and our priorities and our rationality are different. And this is something that we need to keep in mind when we think about Russia now, because they have their, I mean, the Russian president has his own rationality, but it's so different from ours that sometimes it's difficult to grasp and to recognize. I think in Paris there is also a lack of awareness about the history of Russian imperialism and about the persistence of political violence in Russia. And finally, I think that the extent of Russian active measures to influence the political debate in France and the impact of information warfare are often underestimated. So, in a sense, researchers and think tankers, especially those who are specialists on Russia, have a special responsibility here to inform relentlessly the public about all that. And I'd like to add just a few words about the future relations with Russia and the question of the end state. I think the question of the end state with Russia is already a source of disagreements in the EU, and it will just increase. And we need to be aware of that and to discuss that issue. On the one hand, there are those who refuse to see the imperialist nature of the war in Ukraine and who think that it is possible to come to an agreement with the Russian president and that once the agreement is reached, he will be as good as his words. Well, I think you understand what I think of that. But among those who accept to see reality as it is, there are disagreements on the answer to give. How to reduce Russia's aggressiveness and its capacity to harm. One can seek to weaken Russia economically and contain it militarily, while helping Ukraine as much as possible by sustaining its economy, by training its military, and by delivering arms supplies. This is, I think, the dominant position within the EU. But at the same time, this approach has not been very successful so far, since the war goes on. But others, and I would like to finish with that, others may consider that military weakening is not sufficient, that Russians are imperialist by nature, that this is something in the political culture of Russia, and that therefore the only way to defeat this new form of imperialism is to, I quote, decolonize the country, decolonize Russia. So some people would say Russia must stop being an empire and become a normal country. I would like to understand what they imply and how to achieve such a result. And I ask, it is an open question for all of you, is it in the best interest of Russia's bordering countries and EU members at large to see a revengeful Russia plagued with internal turmoil and ethnic wars for decades to go? And I think that if you want to have a French point of view, no one in Paris would support a policy aiming at the implosion of Russia. This is for sure. I mean, this is very consensual. So in conclusion, I must say that, personally speaking, the lesson I drew from the full-fledged war on Ukraine, from this invasion, is that the unthinkable is not impossible. And I'm very pessimistic about the future of Russia. I'm much more optimistic about the future of Ukraine, although the scale of destruction is appalling and the suffering are uncountable. And there is no end in sight for this war. But I think while helping Ukraine to the fullest extent possible, and while integrating Ukraine within the EU, step by step, I think at the same time caution should be exercised and long-term thinking should prevail in the spirit of the EU founding fathers. Otherwise, there will be only losers in Europe. Yeah. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving us so much food for thought, and I'm quite sure that there will be questions from the audience, but please be patient with us because we have 3 other excellent speakers, and I will not be so democratic with the gentlemen now that you had, of course, the chance to also give us such a comprehensive overview on Russia's war against Ukraine. I tolerated the overstretch of your time, but our next speaker is not going to witness the same fate. And speaking of which, we have a very interesting topic that Roland is about to cover, because when we talk about Europe's global role, the first thing that pops up in the mind of Europeans is, of course, the normative power. The normative power of Europe over the last 30 years, the very fact that there are still countries that want to join the Union, and also the very fact that in terms of norms, rules, but also in terms of human rights, and we've heard already values, we've heard about the different rationalization from Céline. So I would like to give the floor to Roland to give us his perspective on Europe as global normative power, but also on the challenges coming not only from Russia, but as we saw from the last 8 months of war, there are other partners in crime that have been practically supporting this, let's say, conflict, as President Zelensky, by the way, pointed out, conflict or a war of world views, or even as best-selling author Nassim Taleb pointed out, a war of systems. So give us your 2 cents on that, and what should we expect from the future role of Europe in that matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Velina. Thanks for having me. You know, if I was British or American, I would have to start this with a joke. Thank God I'm German. So all I can come up with, all I have to come up with, is a true story. Actually from a place that is today Western Ukraine. It used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, about 120 years ago or so. So you know Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, came to a local shtetl and asked the rabbi how he judges the situation of the Jews in town. But Theodor Herzl was always short of time, so he wanted a really quick answer, and he said, in one word, Rebbe. So he said, the Rebbe said, good. Now that's not the answer that Theodor Herzl wanted to hear. So he said, all right, I'll give you 2 words to describe the situation. Not good. In that spirit, I would like to answer the question about the narrative of democracy versus autocracy. So I'll start with why some people say it's not a good narrative, and then I'll give you a couple of points why I do think it is a good one. So not good in this case. Oh, and after that, of course, I'm going to answer your initial question, Velina, about Europe's role and the question of values and norms. So, not good. You know the term the Global South. It has been mentioned a couple of times this morning already. And you know, in fact, when we like to tell ourselves the story that Russia is completely isolated in this, well, that's not entirely true. You know, I mean, there's a whole number of countries that actually prefer not to take sides, and in fact, really enjoy telling Americans and Europeans how navel-gazing they are by saying that Russia is terrible and you have to take sides against Russia. So, you know, this global South, as I call it, whose leader may be India as a country, this global South, of course, has anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism as its mega vision for the world. And we're going to come later on to the point why I think they're shooting themselves in the foot, above all themselves, by not taking sides in what is happening now. The second point that is usually brought forward against the narrative of autocracy versus democracy says that, look, there's a number of countries, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, a couple of other countries that are clearly not democratic, but considered as partners, allies, like-minded in some respects by the West. Fair point. And the third one is that many people that are opposed to this narrative, democracy versus autocracy, are pointing to, from Viktor Orban to Donald Trump, to the internal doubts about democracy inside the West itself. Right, so 3 times not good, huh? Now, why I think, nevertheless, there is something to this narrative, I also give you 3 points. And the first one is, as far as internal contradictions in the West are concerned, absolutely, yes, they exist, but there are ways to deal with them, such as, for example, inside the European Union, the rule of law mechanism that has just been developed and adopted. And, just like the fact that theft is not only illegal but also punished doesn't mean there are no more thieves, right? And nevertheless, no civilized society would say, okay, since theft exists, let's stop fighting it. And the same principle I would apply to the violations of the rule of law that exist in the European Union, that exist in other countries. So no democracy is perfect, but an organization like the European Union that precisely has a normative claim to its role in the world must first of all fight violations of the rule of law inside its own organization. So there has to be a price for violations of the rule of law. That doesn't mean that this will finish, that this will end tomorrow. Second, as far as the inconsistencies in the narrative are concerned when it comes to countries like, for example, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, and so on, well, I would conceive of the global West as a system of concentric circles, right? You have in the core Europe or the European Union and North America. You have around this a whole number of other democracies around the world. The word Rammstein coalition was named this morning. That was pretty much 45 countries or 50 countries around the world, including South Korea, Israel, Japan, and others. Canada, of course, Australia, and others. Countries that conceive of themselves as democracies but are not part of NATO at the moment. And around this, yes, you have a number of countries that are not democracies, with whom, nevertheless, there exist communities of interest of the democracies vis-à-vis dictatorships like Russia and China. So, concentric circles. And on this one, also, I already said this colonialism, imperialism narrative of the global South. I must say, if changing borders by force and declaring countries as non-existent or not having the right to exist becomes possible in the world, I believe it's the global South that is first of all going to suffer. If Russia and China are allowed to expand their particular view, and there are differences between the two, sure enough, but if they're allowed to expand their view on the global order to the entire world, it's the global South that is first going to suffer. And let me come to the third point in this one, the authoritarian countries themselves. You know, there's something interesting going on among the autocracies of this world. They don't have a unifying ideology as communist countries used to have before 1989, 1990, 91, before the end of the Cold War. So some talk about Marxism, Leninism. Chinese Communist Party talks a little bit more about it now. Iran doesn't talk about Marxism, Leninism, and yet they all help each other with money, with weapons. I mean, look at the Iranian exports of drones to Russia now. And they help each other with what is nicely called regime security. You know, facial recognition systems, big data systems to control whole societies, to prevent open debate, to scare people into submission. I mean, all these are things where we have a best practice exchange day by day between the autocracies of this world. They certainly have learned the lessons of the communist regimes at the end of the Cold War, and they want to do better than that. And they help each other, big time. From Venezuela to Cuba, to Russia, to Belarus, to Myanmar today, China, Iran, and many, many other countries in the world. They have something really existential in common, and they know it, and they cooperate. So who keeps the democracies of the world from cooperating with each other? Why do some people say that Europe's role, for example, in the systemic rivalry between the US and China, Europe's role is somewhere in the middle? We should stay out of these great power conflicts. Why are they saying that? Russia and China are clearly helping each other in this. Yes, Xi Jinping has said we are strongly worried about countries that threaten the use of nuclear weapons. Well, if that's all he has to say about Russia's crimes against humanity, that is still helping Russia. And China has no interest at all in Russia losing this war, that's for sure. So let me just say on this point, Europe's role cannot be to be a kind of third force here and to distance itself from the other democracies of the world. As long as the autocracies cooperate so intensely as they are doing at the moment. And I want to finish with this perspective of what exactly are democracies going to do then? How can they help each other? And what is the prospect? Are we going to see a Cold War 2.0? Are we going to see a new global confrontation that will escalate? We had the word escalation repeated several times by Céline. Well, on the word escalation, by the way, I would have a lot of comments to what you said, but just one thing. The idea of deterrence includes targeted escalation. Let me make that very, very clear. So I believe that the West has, vis-à-vis Russia and China, emphasized de-escalation way too much in the past. And we have contributed to the increasing aggression by Russia as well as China through our glorification of the principle of de-escalation. If you answer every aggression by an offer for talk, for negotiation, for consensus, not humiliate the other side, you encourage that kind of aggression. We have done that way too much. The war in Ukraine right now is partly a result of this fetish of de-escalation. So how else so defense and deterrence is the arch principle of democracy's reaction to this new onslaught by autocracies in the world. Of course, Ukraine must win this war. We're going to come to that later in the debate. Of course, democracies have to help each other in societal resilience against sabotage, against cyber attacks, against information warfare, against disinformation, against blackmail, against strategic corruption. Talk about the energy dependence of Europe, and especially my own country, Germany, on Russia. There was a lot of strategic corruption involved. And we will get to the base of this in the months and years ahead. But this is something where democracies can actually exchange best practice, how to make ourselves more resilient against that kind of threat, against dependency on autocracies and so on. And a final point, the global solidarity of democrats, right? I mean, the narrative of autocracies is each country is on its own. You know, there are big differences. But, you know, Germans want something different from French. Japanese want something completely different from Americans, and so on and so on and so on. I think we might as well take a look at Iran right now. The women and men of Iran who are risking their well-being, their personal liberty, and in many cases their lives, and losing their lives for goals that we claim are the basis of our societies. Freedom. Freedom of speech, free choice of how they dress, and a democracy, and they shout death to the dictator. So this whole authoritarian narrative that people can be scared into submission is collapsing in the country of Iran. It will collapse in other countries in the future. There is no reason, and by the way, this again comes back to Russia. Are Russians genetically unable to build a democratic polity? In my view, there is no country in the world that is unable to build a democracy. There's a famous Chinese argument that democracy and Chinese culture are incompatible. Well, look at Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the world's most vibrant liberal democracies. So there's no reason to despair. You know, from Iran to many other countries, the best and the brightest, very often young people, well-educated people, are risking so much to defy authoritarianism. So who are we to claim that we need to differentiate, we need to be careful, we need to de-escalate, and so on? That is not where I see Europe's role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roland. And now we move to the topic of economics. And of course, when we talk about Europe's global role, we must think of the fact that Europe is on par with United States and China in terms of geo-economic cloud. So, Peter, please give us an overview as to how do you see this role after the war in Ukraine, and also where are the potential challenges, and if possible, maybe a German view as well, because Germany, as we know, is of course, the engine of the European integration, and the success of German economy is also European Union success. Mm-hmm.
Dear Evelina, dear Werner, thank you very much for this kind invitation and also the cooperation between Martens Center and your institute. It's always a delight. Evelina, you asked me to tackle two topics in particular. This is one, Europe as a global economic power, and in particular the German role as the largest national economy in it. And then to reach out a bit to third partners, because whatever we discuss in economic terms, it's so closely related. And given my experience in 10 years, 15 years in Asia, I will focus a bit on that region from South Asia to Northeast Asia. Well, to start it, what's the current situation in Europe? It's no longer a sector-specific economic crisis, such as the financial crisis, for example, in 2007. And at that time, we still had instruments at our hand to somehow hedge these challenges. This was, to a large extent, an obvious, even foreseeable crisis we created through to back regulatory framework, bad practices, for example, in the financial industry. And it could have been avoided. Now, the situation is quite different. We have this kind of polycrisis, as it has been meant. It's a kind of staggering crisis, accumulating crisis, and that really goes into the very fundament of the European model of wealth creation and growth. Because it's a combination between long-term necessary adjustments, such as the digitalization or the sustainable transformation, and of course a lot of short-term crisis. And this creates a mixture of something which we had hardly to deal with. We could not, neither from a science point of view nor from a policy governance point of view, really deal with. This is uncharted water we are sticking in. And this goes, unfortunately to say, beyond the national and even international capacities in terms of governing. So the result is that much of our European model and attractiveness as well is at stake. So we have weaknesses on the hard side, the hard economic power, and you mentioned that, the normative side as well, because Europe was, even in economic terms, also a kind of role model, a different approach than to the Anglo-Saxon world, for example. Think about regulatory standards, which we had been proud of, but this has been weakened now as well. The attractiveness is dramatically lost. What are, in my opinion, the major immediate challenges in this respect, in particular in terms of economic security? Well, what we have to maintain at any price is our diversified, interregionally connected industrial basis. This is key in European economy. We have seen this in many cases in the past, that deindustrialization has hit several Western nations and regions. Think of the north of France to the Ruhr Valley, to southern Italy to some extent. So we never recovered fully from these blows over the last 30, 40 years. So what we have to do is to keep the industrial basis in Europe at any price, despite the economic and energetic crisis, for example. In this respect, Germany, of course, as the core, the axis of European economy, is very much at stake and has a huge responsibility in laying ground for at least a midterm recovery. For the moment, we do not simply know how this economic recovery will take place, or if at all. We can be lucky if it's a kind, what the economists say, it's a U-shaped form of recession, so we will get through this after a couple of years, or we end up in a kind of L-shape form, that we stay for a long term in a kind of recession. So this is still unclear, but nonetheless there are things which have nothing to do with the Russian war on Ukraine. These long-term structural and unsolved issues. But to make it clear, there is no way back to old recipes and old models. The trajectory of a huge transformation in Europe is set. We should, despite all these current crises, never give up this long-term perspective of a transformation of our economies. This is absolutely key. There is no debate. We have made mistakes, of course, for example, in sequencing the energetic transformation in Europe, and Germany is unfortunately the biggest sinner in this respect. But the overall game of a huge transformation has to be set, and I'm quite convinced that Europe only by this will manage to recover, not by going back now to old recipes of the 1960s, 70s, or 80s. It's about, indeed, the economic governance model in Europe, and we have a lot of fields where our homework has not been done in the past, in monetary, in fiscal issues. We have not understood the issue of sustainability and to think in an intergenerational context, because we forget for the moment that the huge burdens we create now is on the shoulders of our children. That is an heritage which is incredible, and we have to be blamed to a large extent in terms of ecology, in terms of economic burdens. This recovery, if we succeed in this respect, cannot be done without closer transatlantic relations. That's the still most important economic sphere. It's not East Asia, as it's often said. It's still the transatlantic sphere where the major economic activities lie. That will relatively degrade, but at the very end, it's still one of the powerhouses in European and transatlantic economy. And there's only in this framework the hope that a kind of rule-based order, also in economic terms, might prevail or can be indeed strengthened. I'm quite optimistic in this respect, even on the side of the United States. They have more and more shown a huge interest in setting up common standards, from digitalization to trade issues. This is an unleashed potential, and we have to work very hard on this in the coming years. The expression of Zeitenwende has often been mentioned, and that is, by the way, not only true for Germany, where we coined this again and become of these famous words like Waldsterben or Angst, which has penetrated other languages. This is true, for example, as well in China. We've just seen the end of the 20th Party Congress, and in terms, and it has several times been mentioned, this is the way more important reshifting and reshaping in international geopolitics. And to sum these results up, it's about securitization, making things safe. That is the predominant perspective in China, for example. Everything is below. It's not economic facts per se. It's how to preserve the political system and enlarging the potential outreach in global terms. Whether we have already realized what is at stake, I have my doubts. I hope that Mr. Scholz, for example, will hopefully learn some lessons during his 11-hour stay but I'm not quite sure, and I still doubt my fellow citizens back at home whether they have really realized. Not that we have just started this discussion. This is a debate we had for many years, but things time and the trickling down takes sometimes really time. And what we have to see, of course, and Roland, you mentioned that issue of alliance building, realism and often the ugly face of nationalism has unfortunately shown up very much. And we have to ask our assumptions. And again, this term of like-mindedness has been mentioned as well. There was a lot of naivete in the past years. And Céline, I think you mentioned this as well, that there is not natural partners or only a handful. If you look around, that is maybe, if I look to East Asia, for example, it's South Korea and it's Japan, it's Australia. Then the things are gone. So there is no natural alliances which simply can count on. This is something which we have to, and Europeans are sometimes quite naive in this respect, not being able to change and to get into the mind of others and to fully understand why they are behaving like that. There's an explanation in each of the cases, but we had been very naive in this respect as well. Jamie, I think you will also elaborate on the power of projecting power in other regions. This is not just an issue of military capabilities, and we had a long discussion to what extent, for example, Europe can engage in the Indo-Pacific. I think that will remain very much limited. It has more powers in economic terms, for example, in regulatory standards. This is something Europe is capable to project power. And I think way more important are what I would like to call second round effects. That means if we strengthen our basis here in Europe, it has huge impact on other regions as well, in a positive sense, of course. People in Asia don't expect Europe to be present in military terms, for example, even not so much in economic terms. But they want to have a strong partner here, and this partner, we have to do our homework. And this is what we should aim in our next year's policy. Another issue, and I would like to close with this, we all have the sense and share the sense of vulnerability and the need for increased resilience. This is something the Asian nations have experienced as well as we. There is a huge field of cooperation, and we have something to offer in this respect. We made our mistakes, but nonetheless, I think we have learned lessons also to some extent, and this is something Asians look at very much at. And to close, what should not happen and what we have to do at any price is to prevent the decoupling and the fragmentation of the global economy. This is something which would be absolutely against any European interest, that would cut into our European wealth model. So let's get out of this spiral of protectionism, might it be greenwashed or whatever. This is something Europe has to avoid. Europe is still the level for a global cooperation. And I'm very optimistic we will go through this kind of recession and restart our engines, new engines, supporting engines, and help others to come with us. This is the power of Europe, which I have never seen diminished. That is weakened, but the basis remains there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And of course, last but not least, we are still at the topic of Europe as a global actor. And if there is one important domain that also needs to be covered, that is the domain of security and defense. So Jamie, give us your view on how Europe can strengthen the security domain, and is Europe going to become this relevant security player in the world, as we've heard from Peter that people in Asia, for instance, don't expect us to be a security.
Well, Valida, the answer to that is the more questions you give me, the longer I'm going to talk. So be careful what you ask for. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I honestly really was expecting at this time on a Friday afternoon to be in a familiar situation where there are more people on the panel than in the audience. So I really am very pleasantly surprised that you're here so numerous. Congratulations. During the British campaign in South Africa, the Boer War at the end of the 19th century, we had a group of persistent, resilient Dutch farmers who hung on to the bitter end, and we called them the bitter enders. So I'm tempted to call you, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon, the bitter enders. Certainly I'm the last gasp, being in the last position. And when I was invited to come here and I saw I was the last speaker, I thought, looking at Werner, who invited me, that this can mean one of two things. Either I was so terrible back in 2019 that he thought that the least embarrassing slot for me would be to be right at the end of the programme, or I was so brilliant that he thought, I'll put him last this time round, so we go out on a big bang. So let's see which of the two it's going to be. Now, why is Europe's role in the world important? Well, basically because it was so non-existent, even invisible in the past. When I was thinking about what I was going to say to you today, I always remember Jacques Puss. Some of you may remember that name, the foreign minister of Luxembourg, who back in 91, when the former Yugoslavia was beginning to disintegrate, proclaimed, "It's the hour of Europe." The hour of Europe, not of the United States. So I had lunch with him in Luxembourg many years later and asked him if he regretted it. And he said, Jamie, I've been a good father, I've been a good husband, but the only thing they've got to be put on the tombstone is this is the cretin who said it is the hour of Europe, when clearly Europe was not ready to act. It didn't have the strategic culture, it didn't have the political will, it didn't have the institutions, it didn't have the military capabilities. And from 1999, the Cologne Summit, which set up the common security and defence policy up until now, Europe has been trying to give itself the instruments to do precisely that. Because if I think of my many years at NATO, my many years on this earth, what I've noticed is that this could be the first crisis since the Second World War in which finally Europe is taking responsibility for the fate of Europe. If you think of Yalta, what role there? If you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Europe could have been incinerated for a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Caribbean. If you think of the way in which NATO's strategy was perpetually dictated by the shifts in US nuclear doctrine over the years, the Balkans, Jacques Puss, the hour of Europe, the need for the Americans to come in and rescue our faltering mediation and peacekeeping efforts. I remember dealing with Kosovo back in 1999, that we had 1,400 targets on the NATO air campaign target list, and only 2 of them were generated by a non-US ally. If you think of Libya, where we ran out of munitions after 8 days and had to call on President Obama to lead from behind, you remember that? And come in and supply those American drones, those American spotters, those American precision-guided munitions, those American tanker refueling aircraft to enable that to go ahead. You remember disputes between Greece and Turkey, where Dick Holbrooke, the late and, for me at least, much lamented US diplomat, said that he was working the phones during the night to stop Greece and Turkey going to war while Europe slept. Might be unfair. And then Cyprus, which has always been in the hands of the UN to find a solution and not Europe. So my starting point is that at least we are maybe seeing a strategic awakening, not perfect, where for the first time since the Second World War, in a major European crisis, Europe is finally taking responsibility for the crisis. De Gaulle once spoke of a Europe for Europeans. We might actually now be seeing Europeans for Europe at long last. What are the indicators that at least make me hopeful in that respect? Well, first of all, you've seen in the current crisis that Europeans are stepping up to the plate. Before the Russia invaded on the 24th of February, the 4 NATO battalions stationed in Poland and the Baltic states, only one commanded by an EU country, Germany and Lithuania, Canada, Latvia, UK, Estonia, and of course the United States in Poland. NATO has now added 4 additional battalions in the Black Sea. France commands in Romania, Italy commands in Bulgaria, the Czech Republic is taking the lead in Slovakia. The Europeans have agreed to turn those battalions into brigades, and already countries like Germany have set up brigade headquarters in Lithuania with brigade elements in Germany to be mobilized. Back in 2014, only one European country, Greece, was spending the NATO target of 2% of its GDP on defence. Today, the number is 9. It's growing. It should be about 15 by 2024 on current NATO estimates. Nearly all of the EU countries have met the target to spend 20% of their defence budgets on modernisation as well. Virtually all countries, therefore, even if they haven't met the NATO target, are spending more. The years of decline have stopped. We see also, I think, in the European Union, a very meritorious effort with difficult acronyms like PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, or the European Defence Fund, or CARD, the Coordinated Review of Defence Planning, to start doing a better job of removing the duplication in national R&D and national capability efforts. PESCO at the moment has about 47 different projects ongoing to form multinational consortia. And if you think today that EU countries have about 176 major weapon systems and the United States 36, you can see the amount of duplication in the system that needs to be eliminated. You also see Europeans in NATO taking the lead on, the Dutch in particular, something called military mobility, which is improving military infrastructure. NATO is using European Commission money to improve its mobility and its infrastructure in Europe on rail, road, of ports, to move military equipment around fast and to overcome any bureaucratic obstacles which could hold up military equipment and borders. The addition of Sweden and Finland to NATO means that now 23 EU countries will also be in the alliance. This vastly increases the strategic overlap between the two organisations and reinforces the West. By the way, 2 EU countries joining NATO vastly help to increase NATO's military power, where the EU this time, not the other way around, increases NATO's military power by adding 9 highly professional armoured brigades to the NATO lineup. We see also for the first time that the EU is spending money on defence directly, common European funds. Martin Selmayr mentioned, of course, the European Peace Facility this morning, which now is not only buying weapons for Ukraine, but also training 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers in the field. Of course, in doing that, the European Union has sort of eaten up the 5.5 billion euros rather quickly, and one thing that I would hope would be that that facility would be stocked up, increased, doubled in the months ahead. The Commission is now taking much more responsibility in proposing things to the member states, not just the European Peace Facility and in the hands of the European External Action Service, but for example, recently Ursula von der Leyen looking at the fact that Europeans have depleted their stocks of ammunition, of missiles, very, very quickly to give to Ukraine, that the EU could have a bulk buy arrangement to allow the Europeans to replenish those very quickly. The reduction of dependencies, Peter was talking about this before, has gone very, very quickly. At the beginning of the crisis, Germany, Italy were dependent upon Russia for about 50% of their gas. Today the figure is around 20% and going down all of the time. Certainly after the crisis, the European Union will be much less blackmailable by foreign powers than it might have been in this particular crisis. Of course, the jury is still out. We know that very, very well on China, where attitudes on how much Chinese investment to allow diverge. China is not Russia after all. But you have seen the beginning of the European Union beginning to reshore vital supply chains, for example, in chip production, for example, in terms of pharmaceutical production, protective equipment, and so on. And also the rare earths issue, which was mentioned this morning. By the way, there is a very good reason to help Ukraine, because Ukraine is one of the biggest sources of rare earths to substitute for China that Europe potentially has at its disposal. And we don't need, unlike Donald Trump, to buy Alaska to buy Greenland, to get access to those as well. You've seen a willingness to impose sanctions, not just against Russia, but for example, the European Union now is moving to impose sanctions against Iran, as there is mounting evidence of complicity of Iran in supplying drones and arms to Russia as well. And the European Union has taken the lead on Ukrainian reconstruction. The EU has basically guaranteed to finance at least 50% of Ukrainian reconstruction and to supply about 500 billion up front to the international financial institutions. The last EU summit in Brussels agreed a special package of 18 billion to help Ukraine with its 1.5 billion monthly budgetary deficit situation. And those conferences did not take place in Washington or San Francisco, but in Lugano, and recently, just last week, in Berlin as well. The European political community was mentioned. My only take on that would be to say two things. Firstly, it's a very worthwhile way of having a dialogue with the countries around the EU, 10 of whom, by the way, 10 of whom have applied to join the European Union on things like energy, on things like migration, and to seek to common standards. But the genius, and I think here President Macron has done a coup de génie, if I can say, Céline, is precisely to make it rather vague. Because by making it rather vague, he's been criticised by this, but he also gives these countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Turkey the impression, hope rightly, that they can dictate or at least determine what's going to be on the agenda. They can shape this themselves, and this is not a made in Brussels, take it or leave it thing either. And then finally, I think from a NATO perspective, what the EU is doing in Africa is extremely valid for European security, because although today we haven't spoken at all about Africa, but our focus has been on Ukraine, and I fully understand why, Europe still faces a number of threats and challenges from across the Mediterranean, particularly the way in which terrorist organisations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have configured themselves in the Sahel, also going south towards Senegal, towards the Ivory Coast as well. NATO has very little of a footprint there, but the EU is financing the African Union. The EU has also, of course, deployed a number of missions in the region as well. The most recent one, Mozambique. Who would have thought that the EU would launch a common security defence policy mission to Mozambique? And to the extent that the EU takes that kind of responsibility, which NATO is not able to take on at the moment, given the emphasis on Ukraine, means that to some degree the EU puts the 360 degrees into NATO, which is what we need at the moment. Now, there are challenges, and I know I'm going to run out of time quickly, so I have to do this in sort of telegraphy fashion. Challenge number one is the US is not going to indefinitely supply 4 out of every 5 weapons that go to Ukraine at the moment. The Americans have spent about 20 billion so far on the weapons packages. And if you count the overall support package, 60 billion plus. After the midterms, I don't think there's going to be, even among the Democrats, the degree of consensus to continue to do that indefinitely. But the situation that we are in with Ukraine, and which Secretary General Stoltenberg has summed up, is Russia can win without anybody else, but if Ukraine does not receive this constant supply of support, financial, weapons, and every other respect, it's going to lose, notwithstanding the incredible bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian army and the people. So first big challenge for this sort of global responsible Europe is we're going to have to step up to the mark. And we can do it because the Kiel Institute for Economics published a report just a couple of weeks ago, which is unbelievable. It points out that so far EU countries have given no more than 4% of their armoured vehicles to Ukraine and no more than 2% of their missile stocks. They've been more content to sort of backfill each other, as with Germany and the Netherlands transferring Patriot missiles to Slovakia in exchange for Slovakia transferring S-300s to Ukraine than to support Ukraine directly. So there's going to have to be a major shift of the effort onto the shoulders of the Europeans, if, as I predict, the war will carry on in 2023 and possibly 2024 as well. Secondly, the Russian way of warfare. We haven't really spoken a lot about this today, but what we've seen in Ukraine is the Russians fight dirty. They violate every law of war that the EU has ever tried to construct. They cause a humanitarian crisis. They threaten to blow up dams. They burn crops. They forcibly repatriate citizens. They kill civilians in deliberate massacres. They occupy nuclear power stations. They provoke environmental crises. They cause 6 million refugees to flow out of the country. If they do that to a NATO country, can NATO deal with that? All of those sort of side effects of a conflict while you're actually fighting the Russian army. So I think the EU and NATO need to work together much more to make sure that in terms of all of these civilian things that are going on, the sabotage of critical infrastructure. Let's look at what Norway has been doing, arresting Russian spies for snooping on their platforms, the explosions of Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 and so on, the cyber attacks, the disinformation campaigns. A lot is going on in a modern warfare which is not so much the classical military fighting that the media have focused on. And so the EU needs to focus on that. And particularly the hybrid warfare bit, where NATO has a toe in the water, but where the EU has far more of the assets to deal with these kind of things. We need to partner. We need to make sure there are no gaps in that spectrum of resilience in dealing with any form of Russian aggression. It won't just come in the form of tanks. There will be a lot of other nasty things going on as well, which we need to anticipate. Diplomacy. We're in a situation where a number of countries are sat on the fence in the UN, about 20, 30 odd countries, the South Africas, the Indonesias, the Indias, Turkey to some degree, even Israel. I wrote my latest article for my think tank this week on calling on Israel to step up to the plate and meet the Ukrainian request to supply more of the missile defense systems that Israel has. Turkey is interesting in this case very much because it could be a potential bridge builder, prisoner of war exchanges, the grain deal, and so on. Egypt is very important if you're trying to keep the South on board on food supplies. The Saudis have shown us that they can hit back hard in OPEC if they don't like some of our criticisms. And so I think a test of Mr. Borrell's attempts to deal with the jungle, as he calls it, felicitously or otherwise, beyond the EU shores, is the notion of how the EU has a more effective diplomacy with the fence-sitters, with the swing states who are with you on Monday, but not with you on Tuesday, and possibly back with you by Friday, if you are lucky. I could talk a lot. I don't have time. I'm not about the Franco-German axis, as we used to call it. You may love it, you may not, but Europe doesn't work unless it's not working, and it's not working particularly well in the defence field, as the postponement of the Franco-German Security Council summit a couple of days ago shows. There's the UK, my own beloved country, which has sort of quit the EU, but thank God hasn't quit Europe. The UK is the third biggest defence spender in the world. It has about 25% of EU military capability across the board at the moment. And clearly, what we do to keep the UK engaged beyond Ukraine in European security defence is key. It may not happen with the Brussels institutions yet, but the UK is in groups like the Franco-British Joint Expeditionary Force, the Nordic Expeditionary Force, Visegrad Cooperation, and it has got now British troops once again stationed in Germany at Senilager. So pragmatic working with the UK is key. And then my final point, which was mentioned, is developing this long-term geopolitical relationship with the United States, which has begun well with the Biden administration. The G7 is back. It's meeting in Munster today. And it's meeting in the room where in 1648 the Peace of Westphalia was concluded with the doctrine of the inviolability of the sovereignty of states, which Russia, which clearly was not in the room in 1648 and therefore does not have a long memory, has violated in the case of Ukraine. But it's interesting that the G7 is now back as the central coordinating mechanism on sanctions, on engaging the South, on investment, on technology standards and so much else, which is a good way for the EU represented there, together with the UK, together with France and Germany, to work with the United States and many others as well. And how we do that in terms of technology standards, in terms of investments, in terms of securing vital supplies like chips and rare earths, in dealing with cryptocurrency and klepto oligarchs, all of those kind of mechanisms is going to be key. Also, how we define what the European role in the Asia-Pacific would be. It doesn't necessarily have to be military, but in the trade area, Europe has a lot of clout indeed, and in the normative area as well. So, in a nutshell, I'm sort of feel that, you know, out of every crisis or tragedy, some good arises. And I would say that we're not talking about European strategic autonomy, but about European strategic responsibility. And if this is the first crisis since 1945, where Europe is once again able to take the bulk of the responsibility for itself, a better Europe will emerge, and we will also integrate Ukraine into that Europe too, in the fullness of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And now we open the floor for Q&A. So feel free to ask questions to our guests. Please refrain from long comments, as we want to respect everyone making the effort to come on a Friday evening in Austria and to attend till the very end. So let's give the chance to everyone who wants to ask a question and refrain from the long comments. Also, our guest speakers are staying certainly for at least several minutes after the session if you really want to, express your opinion on a certain issue. So, yes, we start with the first row, and then we move on that side, and then from there we move also on the other side. I will collect more questions.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have a question to Mr. Hefele. It's about the situation of the gas. We were afraid that we would be freezing during the winter. This is obviously not the case. There's enough gas. However, the problem is the price. And we will not come back anymore to the very cheap prices we had before. What do you think about alternative energy productions, especially also wind, etc., given our legislation, difficult legislation in Europe, sometimes takes more time than it should. And I have also a question to to Jamie Scher. It's about the current stage of the conventional army of Russia, how it is, and the supplies. We have seen they cannot do blitzkrieg, obviously, not between Belarus and Kiev. And they can terrorize the people. However, how is it in the battlefield? How good are they there? And their quality of soldiers, motivation, and also cooperating different army sections together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we move to the gentleman in the first row. Please, no long comments, just a question.
Good, thanks a lot. Yeah, just a question to Roland FREUDENSTEIN about the EU joining NATO as the next step for our statehood as the European Federation. And is that possible, Roland? And is this the next step? Maybe to Mr. Scher shortly as well, for Kosovo, Bosnia, they are also under threat of Serbia. And can you also see that we have a next NATO enlargement round after now with Sweden and Finland, where Austria and Bosnia, Kosovo and Ukraine join NATO together and will be secure? Mrs. Chakarova, maybe directly to you, why don't you lead the debate for Austria to join NATO? This would be wonderful. You're such a powerful communicator, a great event, and your leadership would make all the difference if you go out in the media and tell the Austrian public that it's time to join NATO. And please, for Mrs. From France, I didn't get, where's Mr. Macron? He's a bit missing in action. I miss him, and he doesn't want to defend us. And what's wrong with him? And from the Martens Center, the last question, and I stop there. The EU has the opportunity to issue a debt deal. We did it in COVID, and the Germans have now spent 200 billion for themselves. Yeah? Why don't we do a debt deal and we contribute to the victory of Ukraine with common defense spending? That would be the way now forward. And why is Germany only thinking about itself?
Thank you
not
very
about
much.
Europe?
We got the questions. Let's move to the gentleman in the last row, and from there we move to the other section, so that we will gather a few more.
Thank you very much. So I have got two short questions. The first question is the role of France in global power of the EU. So France in the EU now, only one nuclear power and the second largest economy, and France is a proud nation of French Revolution, representing the normative power of Europe. And the second question is for Ms. Marangè. So for you, yeah.
Yes,
for you.
thank you.
So my question is, so my second question is, why Russia see the enlargement of NATO as a threat? Because it is quite puzzling. Because NATO is always take care in order not to provocate Russia, and it is unthinkable that NATO attack Russia. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's move to the other. We start with Adam in the last row, and then we move to the military attaché of
I
Switzerland.
will stick to one question only, which is, recently President Putin announced that he would discontinue the grain deal, but then had to backtrack, which to me was a sign of, well, some semblance of rationality and him acting on that. Are we allowed to deduce from that that maybe when it comes to the nuclear threat, are we allowed to be a bit more hopeful about his rationality and decision making?
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, please, first row.
A question to Céline. Is Putin going to blow up the Dnieper dam upstream of Kherson? Is this the reason why Putin is evacuating the population and thinning out the Russian military on the West Bank? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, who would like to start first? We have gathered a lot of questions. Maybe let's start with Roland,
Yep.
and then we move.
Gunther, I didn't completely understand your question. You said the EU joining NATO?
Yeah.
The EU as an organization. Well, first time I hear this. It strikes me as a fantastic idea. Seriously, strengthening the European pillar in NATO, I think, is a very, very good and necessary thing. The EU as a whole organization cannot join a military alliance, I think. At least that's my perception. But I think what you really want to say is Austria joining NATO, right? There we go. Okay, so you're trying to do it through the back door. Yes, very smart. Very smart. I think we need to discuss this over a beer. But I generally, seriously, the more the merrier, right? NATO, I think the Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO is a fantastic plus for the alliance. I mean, military cooperation has already developed quite nicely between those two countries and NATO in the past. But to have them fully members, I think, is a great idea. And the same would be true, for smaller countries such as Malta and Ireland. And it certainly would also be great to have Austria in NATO. I would love it. Okay. So, and I want to say a word about the nuclear threats by Putin, because this is really important. And, you know, Putin has a fantastic ability. I think an ability that he actually learned as a teenager, in his early teens, before he even became a Chekist, a KGB officer, in the backyards of Leningrad in the early 1960s, because he was a hooligan. You know, he was a little crook that, partly because he was rather short and skinny for a Russian, he had to be more ruthless and faster and more perceptive of the weaknesses of his opponents than the big guys that were surrounding him at the time. And that means he knows exactly how panicky the debate gets in the West when he just mentions the word nuclear. I think a big factor in this completely hilarious, well, not hilarious, tragic actually, narrative about the dirty bomb being built by Ukraine, which has been deflated now, but it was around for a couple of weeks. I mean, one of the reasons why he and his people did this was just to mention the word nuclear, and knowing how Western nerves get jittery when a Russian just mentions nuclear weapon, right? So that's the first thing you have to recognize, is he knows exactly how this works, and that's why he is doing it more and more often. Now, the other thing, he may actually be tempted to use a nuclear weapon because he thinks that way he's going to get the West to force Ukraine to negotiate, right? By withdrawing weapons deliveries, withdrawing support, stopping blackmailing Ukraine into negotiating. By the way, something that the French and the German governments have actually done in past years with the Minsk II agreement, pressuring Ukraine, telling the Ukrainians, we know it's not fair, but that's the way the world works, you know. We know the Russians haven't fulfilled their part of the Minsk II deal, but you have to. You Ukrainians have to. And there were even attempts of talking like this to Ukrainians before the 24th of February, or even a few days after. Thank God the Ukrainians have not given in to this. But coming back to the nuclear weapons, I mean, it's very simple. These threats must be answered, first of all, by a clear message that there will be a retribution. Maybe not in kind, maybe a Russian use of a nuclear weapon will not trigger a NATO use of a nuclear weapon, but the messaging from the US has been discreet but very clear that there will be a conventional attack on the base from which the Russian nuclear weapon is launched, or the airfield, or the missile base, or whatever. To make clear to the soldiers that would actually launch the weapon, they will be dead 10 minutes after they push the button, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is to make it absolutely clear that the use of a nuclear weapon by Russia will not lead to the West pressuring Ukraine to negotiate. And with that, we actually make it less likely for Russia to use the nuclear weapon. So, I mean, that's deterrence at work, ladies and gentlemen. And my dear French neighbor, yes, that is deterrence. It's good. Let's have a disagreement here. We're in a democracy. It's a free country, thanks to our nuclear weapons.
I would like to have your certitudes. I think it's dangerous certitudes.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Doesn't have anything else.
That's it.
If you have covered the questions that were addressed to you, we can continue with Céline. You can also respond to Roland.
Maybe I can add just a word about what has been said. Putin is not the only one, as I mentioned earlier, to think about the use of tactical nukes, and not only tactical nukes, to end a conventional war. I mean, we have witnessed an expansion of the parameters of the use of nuclear weapons over the past 20 years. The nuclear doctrine of the Russian Federation that in 2020, I mean, there have been adding new points and new parameters to use nuclear weapons. So this is not only, I mean, this is not only Putin using this rhetoric to frighten the West and to limit, I mean, the answer. I think this is much more. They have a comprehensive approach to that, and I also would like to mention the fact that very serious Russian experts, moderate experts, have expressed concerns, deep concerns about that over the past month. So you can have, I mean, if you are, I mean, you can have your view on that, but we should be careful. This is my opinion. We should be very careful, because if he is, I mean, they don't have the moral
Scruples.
They don't have the moral scruples. And, well, I will confine to that comment. About your question about the Kakhovka barrage, right?
Question about the dam, whether you think that the dam will be blown up.
Yes.
There was a question.
The dam,
for you.
the barrage dam.
Yeah. The dam.
I think it's implausible in my view. It's not going to happen for the simple reason that from that dam, it is the place where the canal, the Crimean Canal, start. And so if they blow up this dam, Crimea won't, I mean, there won't be any water supply to Crimea anymore. So they are not going to, I mean, I think for them it would be a disaster, because the issue of water has been a crucial issue for years. So I don't think so. And I think why they are deporting, not evacuating, but deporting people from the Kherson region, it's difficult to say. My guess is that it's for political purposes, for domestic political purposes, to sell the narrative that they are saving their lives and they are doing their best to, I mean, to manage the situation, although because of the NATO implication in their narrative, they are encountering difficulties on the front line. Yeah, I think I will, yeah.
And maybe they can blow up the road to the dam, which could be destructive enough.
No, but
without
the idea was
that
they would blow up the dam and it will be flood everything. But I don't see it coming. No.
Would you like to respond to the role, to the question on the role of France? Okay.
Well, yeah, I won't respond to everything, rest assured. On Russia, although Céline is the expert here, not me, I mean, Bismarck, Bismarck's very quotable, like Churchill. Love him or hate him, but he's quotable. And he said, Russia is never as strong nor as weak as it seems. And, you know, it would be easy, if you're a NATO ambassador, perhaps to say, well, you know, where's the problem? You know, Russia has been incompetent in Ukraine, its military has really performed badly, maybe we overhyped the whole thing and we don't need to reinforce the collective defence in Central and Eastern Europe, after all. I wouldn't go there. I mean, first of all, as I said, the conflict in Ukraine, I hope not, but it could go on for a few years. And the Russians are not idiots. They will learn. You know, they've changed the commander a couple of times already. They've changed tactics, and they'll learn, as everybody does, as they go forward. The one hopeful sign is that because Russia itself is not being invaded, this is not a great patriotic war against the Nazis to liberate the national territory. So issues like morale, with conscription and so on, popular unrest. Today I saw that Medvedev said that the 400,000 Russian men who had left Russia to avoid conscription were vile traitors. So clearly that social front might be the Achilles heel there. But certainly, if the war goes on, the Russians will come up with new types of weapons, new kinds of tactics. That's why I hope that the Ukrainians can win quickly, while Russia is still, if you like, on the back foot. Because if the war goes on, I think the Russians will find other ways of keeping on hold of their territory. And the Russian Navy has hardly been used, the Russian Air Force has hardly been used. So from a NATO perspective, there's still a lot of potential threat out there. Interestingly, the big story this week, you may have seen it, is they're recruiting Afghans. They're recruiting Afghan special forces in Iran who fled the country after the Taliban took power, but who were not repatriated. I think maybe this was a mistake by the Americans not to have repatriated these Afghan special forces trained by the Americans, because clearly they're going to be relying more on mercenaries. We have Wagner already, and of course we have the boast of the head of Wagner that they're the best fighting forces. They fight better. And if Russia has the money to afford a kind of medieval-style mercenary army, like Gaddafi did for many years, to do the fighting for them, that also could be a factor that could keep them in the game as well. So let's not rush to judgment on exactly how good or bad the Russian army is. On the Balkans, the second part of it, well, Serbia has no interest whatsoever in joining NATO because, of course, it has history, as we say, with the alliance going back to the conflict. And although Serbia is a partner of NATO, given, of course, Serbia also having a lot of dealings with Russia and China, sitting on the fence a little bit. I don't see that relationship evolving very, very much. Kosovo would love to join NATO, but because of the recognition factor, I think there are 4 or 5 NATO countries that don't recognise Kosovo. We can't really move on that. And Bosnia is now gradually embarking on the road towards NATO. It finally has been admitted to the membership action plan. But as long as you have this constitutional paralysis with the Republika Srpska, and Dodic has just been re-elected president of Republika Srpska, he has a kind of blocking minority, unfortunately. So I think that as far as the Balkans coming into NATO are concerned, we're not going to see the kind of quick progress that we saw with Montenegro, Albania, Slovenia, Croatia, to some extent North Macedonia. Well, not really quick with North Macedonia, but it got there in the end. I think the real NATO role in the Balkans is maintaining stability. The flashpoint at the moment is that today, as I speak, in Belgrade, the military council is meeting. The Serbs have mobilized some of their forces this week, claiming that Kosovo is attacking them with drones across the border. It could be gesticulation, but unfortunately, 30 years almost after 1999 and the war, the level of tension between Kosovo and Serbia, the recent thing has been license plates. Yes, license plates can lead to war in Europe today. And therefore NATO still being in the region, together with the EU, I think has to maintain a high degree of vigilance to prevent violence breaking out. Finally, Austria. Well, the worst thing that I could do would be to come to Vienna and give passionate speeches about why Austria should join NATO. I would be deported from Vienna airport the same day, manu militari, and told never to come back. I think, with Sweden and Finland, NATO was pretty clear that we would welcome it, but the decision is with the people of Sweden and Finland. If you want to find out about what it takes to join NATO, as Finland and Sweden did, they had commissions nominated by the parliaments that studied exactly what the obligations and the benefits would be, so they knew exactly all of the technical parameters, then yes, NATO would be open to provide all of the information and so on. But as with Sweden and Finland, you have to wait for some kind of Zeitenwende or strategic shock to the system that suddenly makes a country abandon what has been a successful model. In Austria, yes, it's been a successful model. It's been a happy time. Well, a prosperous country, stability for many, many years in the European Union. When people identify a particular model with success, neutrality has been good for us. I think it takes a big shock to the system to really change that. And of course, Sweden and Finland, being in a different geographical region exposed to Russia, had that shock. But what would be the shock here of a commensurate level which would persuade Austria to turn to NATO. So I don't see it happening anytime soon. If it happened, speaking purely personally, I'm not a NATO official any longer, I would truly welcome it. But again, you know, it has to be something that comes out of Austria. Not some, you know, you've had enough impositions in your history. You had the Anschluss, you've had the Austrian State Treaty, you've had a lot of things that were imposed on you by others. This has to be something that you want to do for yourselves.
Now we move also to Peter, the gas question.
Remains these nasty issues like prices.
Price question.
Well, to start with the bad message, the prices not only in gas will remain high, and part of the truth is it's not only due to the war. This has been long fundamental changes in international energy markets. The demand is dramatically increasing for different reasons. Look to Asia, to South Asia, even to China once they will recover. So there are pressuring factors which tend to maintain, maybe not at that current level, but much higher than we had been used. We lived in a phase of low energy prices which had been not reflected by long-term projections, for example. We will reach, for example, peak exploitations anytime soon. So all the numbers you hear of endless resources, forget them. They are all very much afraid, for example, in the Middle East, that they will soon reach the peak. That means the resources, the usual resources, are overseen to a certain extent. We will not be able to catch up as fast as possible with renewable energies because we run into other kind of dependencies unless we have major technological breakthroughs, which I don't see for the moment. They are in the laboratory stage, but not rolled out. Let aside the whole impacts on the emission. So there might be some corrections in the, for example, Green Deal, but I can only emphasize we should not lose this momentum. This is absolutely necessary. This is a tension which is particularly difficult for policymakers to combine these short-term perspectives and selling things to maintaining a strategic trajectory on which economies have to develop. This is the art of statement craft for the moment, I think, very much. You referred also to the legislation and the regulatory framework. Well, this is something which can be changed, frankly. Now in Germany, we're able to build these LNG terminals within 1.5 years. We have debated this for 10 years. The plans have been there, but there are positions we can change. We did it after reunification, to take the German example, that we can lower the standards and we can proceed faster then. And take the European energy framework, which is a perfect framework. We never realized it. We never take it seriously. Each and every country did what it wanted. It was never a coherent approach. That was rolled out already, I think, 10 years ago. Had we fulfilled what the EU Commission correctly put on our table, we would have never been into that mess we are now. So we should take our own concepts serious and now speed up for that. But the message is the energy prices remain high for not only war reasons. There are fundamental changes in energy markets globally, and this will be a huge pressure, and the biggest challenge is the deindustrialization, the being afraid that, for example, German industry will rethink its investment strategies. We have first signs. I'm less pessimistic that we have a big shift within a short period, but from midterm perspectives, and you must see the investment cycles we are talking about. It's 30 years. If you transform an energy such as the steel industry, this is 30 years of, and that is among the biggest headaches, I think, of CEOs as well as of politics. That's the unpleasant truth. As,
the debt
yeah, indeed. That is a
200 billion
point, yes,
question.
to lower and to smoothen the impact. Well, other countries, by the way, do it as well. The Germans are notoriously bad in selling things and in wrapping things. So they, on one side, are very much pro-European, but if it comes to very concrete measures, they are, seems at least to be very nationalistic and egocentric. I think we will smoothen this, and there's debate going on in Europe and in Brussels in particular to find a European solution and to not contradict attempts, for example, made by the Commission to find a more homogeneous approach and to soften. And it has to be seen, by the way, as part of a larger restructuring, recovery perspective. Money is there. You have to redirect it to some extent. So Europe is flooding in money. It sounds a bit strange these days, but if you put all together these plans we had after COVID, for example, so we have to recalibrate it to a certain extent and use it indeed for the transformation. Again, the message is don't let these aside and think, okay, for the moment we have just to survive. That is a two-layer approach, which is difficult to sell in public.
Much. Let's do a very quick final Q&A round. If there are some additional questions, just raise your hand. If there is someone who still wants to ask a question at almost 6:30. Yes. The lady in the middle, yes. Then the gentleman in the first row, yes, the lady there, the young lady. Then first row, and then we move also to you, and then we finish.
I have a question for Ms. Marangè. I was wondering, for a while, one could read in the media that the closest circles around Putin are sometimes changing his relations to his highest military leaders. He's sometimes exchanging specific people. How would you assess his closest circle currently and his and that impact on, leading military operations as well? Thank you.
Yes, and then we move to the first floor, to the first row. You wanted to ask a question, right? Yes, please.
My question is to Herr Peter. How important is the cheap energy for the rise of the social economy?
What do you mean with social economy?
How important is the cheap energy for the rise of the social economy? How important cheap energy?
And what do you mean by social economy? Do you mean the preservance of the system, the social welfare system? Is it what you really imply? Okay. Yes. So the connection, the nexus between cheap energy and social welfare.
Some here, Jim, what is better for NATO? Russia outside of the NATO or in the NATO membership? Please. What is your philosophy?
Thank you. And we have a gentleman in the last row. Yes?
Did we need to wait for the nuclear attack to make the final decision and to cut the head of the Hydra?
Okay, so you have already the chance to ask a question. So let's concentrate on these two final questions, and I think that we are already actually misusing the patience of our audience. So,
I will start.
Céline,
thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you for your question. I think. This is a question that everyone would like to answer at the present moment, and it's very difficult to document. A lot of people write and say a lot of things, but we don't know what kind of sources they can use to document it. So, first of all, I think we need to be careful with all those speculations. What I see, I think that in the inner circle, we can observe the rise of very radical figures, such as Patrushev, for instance, who is the head of the Security Council and who is a proponent of the use of tactical nukes, for instance, and for years, it's not now, but I mean, he has, it's thanks to him that this was added to the nuclear, to the military doctrine in 2014, and that other points were added in the nuclear doctrine 2 years ago. we also see that Prigozhin, the head of the head of Media Patriot and very controversial personality, is gaining momentum, and he is now, well, he's supposed to have a stronger influence on Putin, since, for instance, he recruited a lot of new volunteers in the penal colony. He is a person who spent 10 years in prison during the Soviet era in the 80s, and he has been very active in the development of information warfare in Europe, in Africa, and of course in the development of the Wagner Galaxy and SMP. And what I don't know how, but Prigozhin seems to team up with Kadyrov at the present moment, with the head of the Chechen Republic. And so if the three of, if Kadyrov, Prigozhin, and Patrushev team up at some point in the future, it could become even more dangerous, in my view. But I'm not saying that they are going to do that right now. It's not, but this is some speculation about one possible scenario. Yeah. The last thing I would like to say about that is, and tomorrow, for instance, in the, I don't know if you know Medusa. Medusa, it's a free and very interesting media that was developed in Riga with journalists from Russia. And there was an article this morning saying that Dugin, who was, I think that his influence on Putin was exaggerated, but in this piece this morning, I have not had a chance to read it yet, but I also, it was said that since the assassination of his daughter, he got special access to Putin, and he is, the one who would advocate more a real imperialist stance, and so you see, I think that the most radical people have a special access to him now, and for others, I think it's very difficult to convey that the situation is not as he would like it to be. Yeah, this is. Yeah.
Thank you, Céline. Now I see that Roland wanted to respond to that, and because there was no concrete question to you in the final round, I would like to ask you whether we are going to see a new ideological competition over rules, norms, standards, values in this emerging global power competition from your point of view, after you respond, after you give your remark on what Céline said.
I would like to start with your question, and I think the answer, in my view, is not that complex. This competition has started already. The ideological competition, the systemic competition of autocracy versus democracy has already gained a new quality in the last couple of years. So yes, I think it's going to intensify. It's not going to be like the Cold War. Each era has its own type of systemic rivalry. But yes, we will live through this. And I think we shall overcome. And as to Russia's future, you see, by the time Putin leaves the Kremlin, which is going to happen at some point, and it won't be voluntary, maybe it won't even be in one piece. Sorry about the macabre joke. So by the time Putin leaves the Kremlin, Russia is going to be in such a terrible state. Yeah. Military disaster, maybe even collapse of the front line in Ukraine, economic catastrophe, maybe collapse of public order in some places, and certainly the regions are going to try to get away from the Russian Federation. Now, at that point, of course, there may be a more radical person following up. You know, or maybe someone from the inner circle, so-called inner circle, tries to do more or less the same thing, maybe with a little bit more or less confrontational language vis-a-vis the rest of the world or something. Yes, maybe. But that will not even remotely address the problems that I've been describing for Russia. So what I'm saying here, by the time Putin leaves the Kremlin, the incentives for his successors to do some things fundamentally differently will be huge. It doesn't mean that there will be a liberal democrat following directly upon Putin. Maybe we get a 1917-like scenario with actually 2 coups in short succession. But the second or third, I would think it possible that the second or third will be won by people who say, all right, we need to re-establish order, but here's the timeline. There will be a constitutional assembly. We will formulate a new constitution. There will be a referendum on the constitution. And at some point in the future, there will be a devolution of power to the regions in order to keep them inside the federation. And then there will be a multi-party democracy. But the people who have to achieve that are the Russian people themselves. And there's no 82nd Airborne Division is going to descend over Moscow and kill Putin. That is not going to happen.
Now let's move
Still
to
have
Peter.
to answer
Yes.
the gentleman's
Because
question
you have a
regarding
question about the nexus.
the prices. Yes, that lies at the core of the current social tensions as well. But again, the challenge is nothing new. We have very much focused on transformations, but we left out the social dimension in many countries. So this was not answered, and in this respect, that's a challenge for many political parties, for example, to get back to the underlying social problems, the inequality. We have, take the example of Germany, we have a huge shift in income due to the different burdens of energy prices for an energy. You know, the price is not the challenge in many ways. It's the additional components on taxation, on redistribution. So this is a big issue nobody touches, because to say it in simple words, green is good. But we have never touched upon the social consequences and the unwanted redistribution effects. This is a very hard topic to be discussed, but it will fall on our feet anytime soon, even without the war, because the transformation will speed up and the costs will be more obvious. And we waste, by the way, a lot of money in misallocation. A lot of that money we spend here in Europe, and we have mentioned these exterior effects and South. Roland, you refer to the global South. We should have invested much more in those regions. We had a bigger impact on the global changes, and we had strengthened our leverage in terms also of policy, of normative power in Europe. We lost this momentum. We focused very much on our domestic solutions. We had not in mind that the global effects had been way more positive in engaging elsewhere, including the positive effects on this diversification. Now we are desperately seeking to North Africa, for example, to get our sources there. We could have done that 10 years ago, with many positive effects on the societies there, including effects on migration, for example, on wealth creation there. So we have never understood the complexity of these kind of transformations. This is the biggest challenge, I think, for policymakers in Europe.
Thank you very much. And
yeah,
once again, you are about to show us your brilliance.
Oh no! You're being too
responding very shortly.
You're being too nice to me. It's another way of saying be short. Well, the Russia inside NATO question is an interesting one. I mean, traditionally, the Russian attitude to NATO is it should not exist. You know, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved in 1991. There's no need for NATO. NATO, by definition, is focused on Russia, and therefore NATO creates the very threat that it's designed to defend against. And this goes way back to the Stalin plan of 1952 to create, instead of a two-block system in Europe, a kind of League of Nations-style collective security system. Russian thinking has evolved. I was actually personally in a meeting in the Kremlin in 2004 with Putin, not on Zoom, in person, where we spent about an hour talking about Russia joining NATO, and he asked a question. And his thinking at the time was that Russia should have the same position as France, although France does not have that position any longer, which it would be part of the political construct of NATO, but it would not integrate into the military structures. There would be a kind of separate, like when the Roman Church split between Rome and Constantinople, there would be a kind of, exactly, there would be a Russian sort of command structure dealing with Eastern issues and a totally separate sort of Western structure dealing with Western Europe, so that NATO would not therefore have any kind of droit de regard or leverage over Russia's military decisions. It's rather like Israel in a kind of way, a member of the West, but doesn't want to have any kind of constraints on its freedom of action in dealing with security issues as it sees them evolve. Of course, today it's off the table because relations with Russia, between Russia and NATO, are all-time low. Even if we have a good outcome in Ukraine, whatever that is, it's difficult to think that those wounds are going to heal anytime soon. The level of mistrust is massive on both sides and probably will endure after Putin retires from the scene. A change of leader is not, like in a Walt Disney movie where the wicked witch dies at the end. A change of leader is not going to turn things around precisely. But there are two basic problems, very briefly. Number one is that we've seen recently, over the years, a set of examples where having Russia in a multilateral organization, think UN Security Council, think Council of Europe, Russia has now been suspended, think UN Human Rights Council, Russia has now been suspended, OSCE, where having Russia in these organizations is almost a recipe for paralysis within the organization itself, which is, I think, going to make people super cautious. The habit of Russia in a multilateral setting at the moment doesn't suggest that the benefits outweigh the costs. The second thing, if Russia joined NATO, the Chinese would perceive that immediately as the great holy alliance of the North ganging up on the rest of the world. And to my mind, it's not in the strategic interest of the West to sort of create that kind of super alliance against the rest type of thing. The other thing, of course, with NATO is because of its identity, it's seen as a military alliance guaranteeing against threats. So the rest of the world would argue, well, we must be the threat now if Russia is part of NATO. Where is the strategic direction going? It would be a hell of a job for Nicola DeSantis, who was here earlier, representing NATO's public diplomacy, to explain that one away, in my sense. So I would hope, frankly, with Russia, being realistic, that we could go to an Israeli-Egyptian relationship. We don't particularly love each other. We have differences, particularly on the Palestinian cause, but we've made a kind of cold peace with each other. Our tourists visit each other's countries for holidays. We discuss, basic things like cooperation on security, terrorism, water, and we had that, to some degree, relationship with Russia back in the 90s, where we cooperated on Afghanistan, we cooperated in the Balkans. This was spoken about this morning. We had a similar view about piracy and some of the challenges, but we still had a lot of differences over European security issues. But at the time, we lived and let lived, and we were able to sort of get on with the business. I think most NATO ambassadors would pay half their salary simply to be able to go back to that period.
Wonderful, thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are super excited that you've stayed with us actually till the very end of this really long and insightful day. And we are grateful for that because, as I said at the beginning, I couldn't hope for one. I got actually 4 so exciting speakers at the end of such a brilliant day. And I wish to think that this was also the main reason for you to stay with us until 6:30. So by saying that, I would like to extend my gratitude for your interest, for the excellent questions, and also to use the opportunity to give a small gift to our guest speakers who contributed to the success of this event. Thank you, Michael. Si. Okay. Céline?
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Roland?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Jamie?
Thank you very much.
And Peter. Thank you very much. Dankeschön. Danke.